So a question about the centralisation and control of spending through local government, determinants of health. You'll be familiar with that in Redcar,
yes,
and with some of your background in local government work, Anna. So just what's your response to that?
Well, I think you raise a really, really important question. I just think the NHS is one of the country's greatest establishments, and we all love it and value it and try to fight for it every day. But there is a limit, I think, to which the N in the NHS, I think, sometimes does hold us back. And I think you're absolutely right that it's so important, I think, to have local coordination, local drive and local spending around health, because the interrelation between so many of the different factors that drive health, around poverty, around housing, lifestyle issues, I think so many of those are driven at a local level, and I see that within my constituency, whether it's with smoking campaigns I've tried to take up on issues like energy drinks. I think very often when things are organised nationally, people find themselves navigated around the NHS in silos. And actually, I think if you work locally, particularly through the local authority, not only are you able to deal with people in a much more holistic way with all the varying challenges that often are not just health related, but are behavioural related, socially related, but also you're much closer to the problem, and you can have a much greater emphasis on prevention. And I think again that is one of the areas where our beloved NHS just doesn't have the capacity to emphasise. And prevention through, as I say, lifestyle choices, public health is vital. And I'd love to see local government much more heavily funded and much more heavily integrated within the health and social care sector to do that.
John, you've been a councillor.
Yeah, I was a councillor on and off for 35 years, so I've got a fair bit of experience of this sort of thing. I mean, I just really agree with what Anna said. You know, in the end, some of it's to do with resources, not all of it to do with resources, but an awful lot is. And local authorities have had really vicious cutbacks in the last few years, and with protected areas which haven't been cut back. You know, local authorities, prisons and so on have, and you're just now really seeing the fabric of the country, social fabric of the country falling apart to some extent. And a lot of these issues becoming more acute. Although I think a lot of the lifestyle issues, which again Anna referred to, are due to economic insecurity, poor jobs, low incomes, in and out of low-skilled employment, and this all contributes to the pathology that you see all over the country, of enormous disparities in longevity and so on. I mean, I think you're probably familiar with this. Every station you go out on the Jubilee line to the east, you lose a year of your life. Yep. These are terrible figures.
Yep. And I mean, John, you've raised what is has been, in the entire of my political lifetime, one of the great taboos in policy making. The ghost of devaluation in the 60s has hung over every Labour leader and chancellor ever since. But your presentation makes it quite clear that unless that kind of tool can be used as it is used by other economies, that the outlook is extremely depressing. I mean, what do you think could tip the current generation of politicians into using this more effectively? But also, I mean, we have had quite a significant devaluation in the currency, and there may be more to come. Is there any possibility that through this Brexit process we might end up with the kind of numbers that you're looking at, or will the damage have been too great by the time we get there?
Well, to answer the second part of your question first, I mean, what happened is the exchange rate came down from about 150 to 120 after the Brexit referendum. Then it crept back up again, and now it's dropped back again. It's around about 130. I mean, this is still much too high to make it worthwhile investing in a factory in the UK rather than a factory in Germany or China. I think one possible, obviously we're in huge problems about the whole Brexit negotiations, and I'm not suggesting that, there's sort of easy cop-outs on all this. But I do think actually what might happen is a combination of even more problems on that front, plus a Labour government might produce a big fall in sterling. And what I've been saying to John McDonnell and all these people who haven't paid any attention to what I say at all is, if that happens, don't try and get the pound back up again. Blame the Tories for having screwed it all up and made a complete mess of it all, but keep the pound down, because that is actually what's going to do more than anything else to get the British economy back on its feet again.
Now, both of you, you describe an unequal society, and people talk about a two-speed economy, but actually, in your presentations, it seemed to me you were talking about almost two separate economies. And I say this because, you know, over 15 years ago, when I was working with the European Union, virtually the whole of Britain north of Watford was described as a peripheral area in European terms. It attracted social funding and other funding in the same way as some of other parts of Europe did. I mean, is there a complete structural flaw? Is London in the southeast a separate economy? Are we one nation, or are these really two different places? And I mean, Redcar, your experience is particularly brutal, actually.
Absolutely, and you know, when our Steelworks was closed in 2015, I saw there starkly the lack of understanding between policymaking in Westminster and the reality of a constituency like mine. The Steelworks could have been saved. It could have had either a small amount of investment. I think the company at the time were asking for 100 million just to navigate what was then a dip in the market. Ironically, you know, John talking about the fall in the pound. Once the Brexit vote came through, the fall in the pound meant that our steel prices would have been, you know, fantastic, and we would have actually, production would have increased, and the Steelworks would have gone into profit. So, you know, really what we needed was an interventionist government that would have stepped in and assisted then. But when I was making the case down here and saying, look, this isn't just 175 years of steelmaking, this isn't just an industry, this is 3,000 jobs, and it's not just 3,000 jobs that you would miss in London. This is 3,000 jobs in a town that has nothing else. This is 3,000 jobs in a town on which steel was built. And the ripple out effect that has come from that, not just those 3,000 jobs that were lost in the steelworks, but the jobs in childminding, the jobs in for roofers, for carpets, for you know, our town centre. The ripple out effect for our economy has been absolutely disastrous. And I was horrified in 2015 that I could see behind the eyes ministers just didn't get it. They didn't realise what they were doing. They thought they were just flicking a switch, closing down an old, smelly industry that has no place in modern times, which is totally untrue. And the anger then, when you look around the rest of the world where governments are supporting their industries, they're investing in them through skills, research and development, and they're helping them navigate the ups and downs that you're inevitably going to get in a global economy. It was heartbreaking, and we're still reeling from that now. And that's just, it's not just, you know, immoral and unethical and industrial vandalism. It's bad economics.
John?
Let me do a little bit more economics if I can. If you look at the UK, we've got a balance of payments deficit which has been running at around about £100 million a year. London runs a balance of payments surplus about 50 billion, which means the whole of the rest of the country is running a deficit of about 150 billion on the other side. Now, if you look at where that breaks down, you've got some cities outside London which are doing relatively well, like Oxford and Cambridge and Manchester and Bristol, but you've got loads of others like yours, Anna, which are doing very badly. And they're running balance of payments deficits of probably something like 10%, maybe even more in extreme cases, 15%. And these economies, or bits of our economy, are completely dependent, effectively, on handouts from London. And it comes in a whole variety of different ways of taxation and expenditure on social welfare. It's grants, it's loans, it's selling off businesses to pay the way. But, you know, if we're going to have half the country running a massive, massive balance of payments deficit, you're never, ever going to close the gap between London and the rest of the country. The only way you can do that is to give all these areas outside London something to sell. And you're never going to do that with services. The only real way you're going to do that is getting industry re-established. So if you want to get your steelworks back, and I think actually we do need to get steel back, because once you get into manufacturing, you know, having a reasonable steel industry is the backbone of a lot of other industries that depend on it. You know, if we're going to go down that route, we've simply got to address these cost issues. Otherwise, we're never, ever going to get a solution.
And do you think we ought to be, I mean, it's a long time to catch up, but if you look at the French model, where if you go to Toulouse, it's aerospace, if you go to Lyon, it's in the south, there's computing, if you go to parts of the north, it's the motor industry, if you go across to Riems, it's telecoms, but they're spread out. It's quite a sort of structured policy. Is there a place for that, or is that?
I'll tell you what you can do. Essentially, if you want to get the growth rate up from 1.5% to about 3 to 4% per annum, which I think we need to do to get wages up, what you need to do is to switch about 4% of our GDP out of consumption into investment and get a 50% return on that investment. You multiply 50% by 4%, you get 2%. That's the difference between a growth rate of 1.5% and 3.5%. And that's what the world average is. That's not something that's a dream figure that's nobody else has ever achieved before. That's the average for the whole of the rest of the world.
And is the mechanism for that switch taxation?
Taxation doesn't help. It's really getting the cost base in this country, the amount that we charge out to the rest of the world for operating manufacturing businesses in this country competitive with what other people are doing. And you know, at the moment the gap is enormous. Unfortunately, I run a business which imports products from overseas because, and we see this every day, what the difference in cost is. For most of the manufactured products that we produce, which are fairly simple products, we can get them made for about 50%, about a third cheaper in China than we can in the UK. A third cheaper. You know,
to go back to your point about sort of geographical hubs and clusters, I think there's definitely something to be said for that. I think, you know, in Teesside now we're looking to become a real hub for the chemical industry and a real cluster there. That's probably the biggest driver in our local economy. Of course, not too far away in the northeast, we've got Nissan, we've got Hitachi, you know, and of course all of those major investors bring supply chains with them. So that can just naturally stimulate a sort of hub for particular clusters in particular areas. But again, I think this is where government does have a role to help provide the framework, to help provide the help, whether it's through business rate relief or through other mechanisms, to try and support and really give areas that have been left behind a real injection. And that's what they need. If you can create the climate for businesses to come and invest and help build those supply chains, then you really can give those areas a huge boost. And it's government, an interventionist government can do that.
Well, very challenging contributions from both of you, and I think the bones of solutions and ideas are beginning to emerge. It'll be an interesting debate. John Mills and Anna Turley, thank you both very much.
thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.